Good afternoon. It's 2 o'clock Central Time. This is Chris Morris with the FAA in Oklahoma City with the Aviation Data Systems Branch. And we'll go ahead and get started with our presentation today. We're going to be talking about the Pilot Records Database. And this is going to include some walkthrough of how PRD works and what the screens look like and that sort of thing. If you've already attended another webinar, this does have some new content. We go a bit more detailed into the different user roles used in PRD. So we're going to talk about these basic things. I'm going to have a little bit of discussion about the PRD and kind of why the PRD is here. And then this is some new content. If you attended our previous webinar, we're going to cover the user roles and explain how those work and that sort of thing. And then we'll do our walkthrough about how does a pilot use the PRD system, and then how do aviation employers use PRD to look at those pilot records. And then have a few closing points that we'll finish up with. So that's basically what's on the docket. So a little bit of history about, why do we have the PRD. As you may be aware, the Pilot Records Database was required in the Airline Safety and Federal Aviation Administration Extension Act of 2010. And we just like to call that the Act because it's much easier to say. But basically, Congress directed us to create this database. And that's what we've been working on since the Act became public law. So the current status of the Pilot Record Database is it's in beta release, and we'll explain that more in just a second. And it's essentially an alternate method of complying with portions of the Pilot Record Improvement Act of 1996. We also call that PRIA. So we'll cover that in more detail about exactly what portions does it satisfy as well. Now, the rest of the PRD, the way that Congress envisions it, is that it will be a clearinghouse for airman records from industry as well. But that requires rulemaking, and that's in progress. So until the rulemaking is complete, then you're not going to see that function supported in PRD right now. It's just FAA records right now. Let's talk about the beta release real briefly as to why we call it a beta release. The first thing I just want to say, it's not even on the slide, is that PRD is not in like a test. We're not going to shut it off in 6 months. It's on, and it continues to grow in functionality and usage. So if you decide to adopt over to PRD now for your company, if it's available now, it'll be available to you in the future as well. So it is a fully functioning system for FAA records as well. It's not like you're getting partial FAA records or it's test data. It's the real thing. It's the full records. So the thing about the beta release is we do have a concern with the online identity verification, and that's our current challenges with PRD. Is that right now to access PRD you have to register through a system called MyAccess, and it does an online identity verification. And there are some folks that through no fault of their own, they're unable to verify their identity in MyAccess. So that does create an issue, and we are working on coming up with an alternate system, probably going to end up being an in-person system where you'll have to go visit someone. We're still working out the details on what that would look like, but maybe you show someone your driver's license and then they get you in. Maybe it's your POI or something, but we are working on that alternate system. So that's the whole reason it's called a beta release, is because not everyone that wants access to PRD is guaranteed to be able to get in there. So for those that can't use the PRD system because of the identity verification, well, we still have the traditional PRIA process, and that'll remain available until we can resolve our concerns with with the identity verification. So let's talk about some of the differences in PRD versus PRIA, and maybe also the Privacy Act. I know a lot of companies go beyond simply doing a PRIA request for their new pilots. They like to also do a Privacy Act request because you would get a little bit different information. And so I want to take just a second and show you how some of that information is different in PRD. Actually, PRD is better, and a couple of examples. So let me just go through that. So the first thing is address verification. So PRIA would not give you the airman's address as recorded by the agency, nor would the Privacy Act. Well, PRD does give you that. So PRD is able to verify the address for the airman. Of course, all three of those systems will give you certificate verification, type ratings, and those sorts of things. And so that's really nothing particularly new in that respect. And let's see, the next one I want to show you is the medical certificate. We've been doing that as well, through PRIA. Privacy Act, if you were one of those that requested Privacy Act information, you would also get that. Well, PRD includes it. And then closed enforcement, that's something that all three of those would give you, PRIA, Privacy Act, and PRD. Now, this is where we start getting some of the differences. So accident data was not provided under a PRIA request. So if you wanted accident information, you had to go do a Privacy Act request. So a lot of companies would do that. They would make a separate request for Privacy Act information. Well, PRD automatically includes accident records. That's the same for incidents as well. So accidents and incidents are automatically included in PRD. You don't have to make two requests to the agency. You don't have to do PRIA and then Privacy Act. You get them both in PRD. And then there's another difference that you wouldn't get in Privacy Act either, and that's unsatisfactory practical tests. Now, this is since 2010. Okay, so any unsatisfactory check rides, and we're talking about certification check rides like incident rating or something, would be available in PRD. And you couldn't get those under PRIA or Privacy Act. And then the last thing is employment history. An important thing to note here is that this is if the airman provides it. If the airman types in their employment history, then you will see that. But this is not provided by the agency. So we don't vet this or promise that it's accurate or any that sort of thing. I will discuss a little bit later on in the presentation why we encourage the airmen to enter their employment history. It kind of helps them and helps you as well as an air carrier. Anyway, so I hope that slide's helpful to you to show you some of the differences. I should have also written in here that PRD is practically instant access. Once you're granted consent, the carrier can log in and immediately retrieve that record. So you don't have to go fax things off and wait and this sort of thing. So that's nice as well. So let's talk about user roles for a little bit. This is some new content if you attended our last webinar for employers. So I want to try to explain the different roles and kind of the functions that they serve. So the first main role I want to talk to you about is authorized responsible person. And sometimes we just call it responsible person, and sometimes we just say RP because it's kind of a mouthful to say authorized responsible person. But this is a really important, really we should say key role in PRD for companies that want to look at FAA records. Because every company, every aviation employer has to have one person that is an RP. This is the minimum role that every company has to have. You don't have to have anyone else in the system to be able to look at FAA records, but you do have to have an RP. So if your company does not have a responsible person registered in PRD, there's just no way to look at records. So this is the first step that you would accomplish if you're signing up for PRD, is to register someone as a responsible person. Now, it can't be just anyone. It has to be a Part 119 position. So we're talking about the chief pilot, the director of operations, director of safety, that sort of thing. Okay, and that's for legal reasons, because the person that is the responsible person is legally responsible for what happens in PRD. Okay, so if the system is abused or anything of that sort, it ultimately becomes the responsibility of, well, the responsible person. And that's what I just mentioned there, that they are legally responsible for company activities in PRD. Now, here's an important point to make. A responsible person, whoever registers for that role, they actually get two roles in PRD. It happens automatically. It doesn't take any extra steps. They also get the authorized consumer role. And that's a really important point, because authorized consumers are the only folks in PRD that can look at records. So when I say a responsible person can look at records, well, that's sort of true. It's just that they're using their consumer role to look at the record. And we'll kind of see that more in just a minute. I'll keep mentioning that over and over. Now, the authorized responsible person is approved by the FAA administrator during business hours. So there's actually a person, sometimes it's me, sometimes it's some other folks that help me out. Whenever a company registers a responsible person, we check that person against our FAA database as well as OpSpecs to make sure that that person is indeed a Part 119 fiduciary for the company. Okay, so if you don't meet one of those positions, we're not going to approve your request to be a responsible person. We'll, of course, email you and explain that to you so that you kind of understand how that works. But it's also important to note that's business hours. So during holidays or weekends, no one's there to make those approvals. So you would just have to wait until the approvals get done the next business day. Okay. But we're generally pretty quick about it during business hours. We get in there and approve those things pretty quick. We do our best. So the responsible person then can approve other roles for their company. And we'll talk about more of that in just a minute. Okay, so that's kind of it for the responsible person. So the next really key role is the authorized consumer. Now, this is the only role, the only person that can look at records. So I mentioned this before, I mentioned it again. If you are a responsible person, you will also be an authorized consumer. Okay? So that comes automatically. So an authorized consumer, they can view and download and print Airman records. At this time, that's just FAA records, right, that the agency has. So this role is approved and managed by the responsible person, or another role I haven't talked to you about yet, but that's a user manager or authorized user manager. So if you want to be an authorized consumer, you basically request that access in PRD, and then your company's responsible person has to log in and approve that. And the FAA does not approve these roles. The only one that we approve is the main key role of the responsible person. Everything else is done at the company level. So, and I've mentioned this over and over, authorized responsible person also has this role. So I'm kind of driving that home, okay, that's automatically in there. The next role we're going to talk about is user managers. And this is a pretty simple role. They don't do very much except for manage other users. So an example of this might be, the responsible person can approve users in the system, but maybe they don't want to have to do that on a daily basis, right? Because perhaps your responsible person is a director of operations, it's a large company, and they have folks that actually work, maybe down in HR or something that pull these records, and they want someone else to manage the users in the system. So in that case, that's a clear example of when you might want to authorize a user manager, and that's someone that can go in there and approve other roles and also terminate roles if someone leaves the company or whatever. So that's what the user manager role is for. Again, this role is approved and managed by the responsible person, or another user manager could also do this as well. Now, the last role we're going to talk about, and then we'll kind of recap on the roles, is the pilot role. This one's really pretty straightforward. A pilot in PRD, and I know there are some pilots on the webinar today, so I'm kind of directing my discussion to the pilots here. You cannot register in PRD unless you hold an FAA commercial or ATP certificate, and real importantly, an FAA medical. You could have also have taken a basic med course as well and be in PRD. And because PRD is only intended for those commercial or ATP pilots that are essentially, in the job market, right, that are active and probably out looking for employment. So that's why there's that restriction. So if your medical is expired and you go to PRD and you try to register you will not be able to register in PRD. It'll basically say no matching airmen, because PRD won't even know of you. It won't even know that you exist, because we don't even bring you into the system unless you are a commercial or ATP and have a current medical or meet basic med requirements. So that's a really key point. We have a lot of folks that contact us and they're unable to register as an airman in PRD, and it's almost always because their medical is far expired. So that's the reason why. And of course, pilots can review their own records. At this point, it's FAA records only, and they can add and manage their employment history in PRD. And they're the only ones that can grant consent to aviation employers to look at their records. Okay, so a company cannot just go into PRD and pull up an airman's records without that airman first giving specific approval. That's a really key point, and we'll kind of walk through that example. So here's kind of a review of the roles to kind of put things in kind of a visual perspective. So you see the roles on the left-hand side. You got responsible person, and then your authorized consumer, user managers, and then you have your pilots there. So the first column says, approved by the FAA PRD administrator. So, which of those 4 roles do you think is approved by the FAA PRD administrator? Well, as you remember, it's only the responsible person. That's the only one that I or my coworkers actually go in and approve during business hours. So the next question to the right is, which of these users is approved by a responsible person? So basically, the company handles it in-house. That's going to be the consumer roles, if you're going to add any of those. And it's going to be the user managers as well, if they're going to add those folks. Next question is, who can grant consent to their records? Well, the only person that can grant consent is the pilot. Okay, so that only happens with the pilot role. And this also applies if you happen to hold both roles. Maybe you are a consumer for a company, and maybe you're also an airman, you're a pilot. So you might have 2 different hats that you could put on in PRD there. So the next question, which of these roles can view airman records, can actually search and pull up the records? Well, it's the consumer role, right? That's the only one that can do that. Now, I do hesitantly put a check mark by a responsible person, but that's only because if you're a responsible person, you are also a consumer. You have both roles automatically. Okay. Next question is, who can approve and manage authorized consumers? Well, that's going to be the responsible person for a company. They can manage those approvals. And a user manager can also do that as well. And then the last question, who can approve and manage other user managers? Well, that's going to be the responsible person. You see they have a lot of things that they can control in the system. And then also user managers can approve other user managers. So that's kind of the table that kind of rephrases what we said in the text format. So I hope that's helpful and gives you a little explanation of the different user roles. Okay. So now we're going to move on and go through the general process. How does an airman grant consent, and what does that look like, and what's it look like when an employer is going to look at those records later on? So let's start with the airman. So the general process, and we'll look at the screens in just a second, is the first thing they do is they log into PRD, and then they enter their previous employers. I do have down that that's optional. We hope that they'll do that because that is going to be really helpful. I'll try and explain why, briefly when we get to the right spots. But they don't have to do that to grant a company consent. They can skip all the previous employment part and just grant you consent, and you'll still see all the FAA records. So it doesn't really change that part. So then they grant you consent, and that's basically it. Okay, that it takes about 10 seconds to grant an employer consent. I know because I do it frequently, most of the time for testing. accounts and things, but it is really a very fast process. So now let's look at the employer side of it. You know, what are the steps that they have to follow? Well, they log into PRD, and then they have to search for that airman by certificate number and name. You have to have both, certificate number, and technically it's either the first name or the last name in order to search for an airman. And then they can view or even download that PRD Airman record. And yes, we have an acronym within an acronym. So PRD Airman record we also call PAR. Okay? So if I call it a PAR, I'm just referring to those records downloaded from PRD. And then I have a note here, you still have to use traditional PRIA processes to request those non-FAA records. Now that's for right now, because remember PRD only provides the FAA records. So let's go through the screenshots and kind of see what this looks like when this really occurs. Now this is the PRD homepage, and I do want to point out there's two buttons, two large blue buttons. There's one on the left and there's one on the right. One on the left says PRD Airman Records, Grant Consent, and View Records. So if you want to do anything with the actual Airman records, you would click the left-hand button. And that's if a pilot wants to grant consent, or maybe you're an employer and you're going into View Records, where you would do that with the left-hand side. Now the right-hand button is just some additional tools used by air carriers, and mostly it's about managing users. So this is where you would log in to request access to be, for example, an authorized consumer. This is where you might log in if you are a responsible person to approve a pending request. There's also some logs in there that you can look at as well as an air carrier. So really important. Those are kind of two different applications that you're using there. So we've had some confusion about, you know, folks wanting to look at records, and so they click on the right-hand side and it doesn't work for them. Well, if you want to look at records, it's the left-hand button. So in this example, we've got our pilot hat on, and we're going to log in as an airman. So I'm going to click on the left-hand button, PRD Airman Record, and then I get the My Access login screen. And this is where I have to log in with My Access. If you don't have an account in My Access, you will have to register and, of course, complete the online identity verification. Okay, so you log in there through My Access, and then once you've logged in, you have to accept the system use notice. Those are pretty typical for the agency. And then this takes you to the basically like the landing page for PRD. And if you are a brand new airman, and by brand new, I mean not yet registered in PRD, and this is your first time to come to PRD, you will not see this screen, but you'll rather see a registration screen where they'll ask you for information about your pilot certificate, and that's when you would register. But this is assuming that you've already enrolled as an airman in PRD, so you would get this screen where you make sure that the role shown here says pilot, and then once you make sure that you're on the pilot role, and then you're going to just select to log in with that particular set of privileges. So the first thing it shows you once you enter is essentially your FAA records. Remember, we have our pilot hat on right now. So you basically get to look at your FAA records immediately as the system has them at that moment. You will notice there's a menu bar across the top there, disapprovals, enforcements, accidents, incidents. So you can browse through your records by clicking on those various tabs, and you can kind of review all the information. Another thing I want to point out to you that is super handy is in the right-hand corner. I don't know if my arrow shows it, and my arrow doesn't go to it yet, but there is maybe I can highlight it for you. Let's see if I can do that. So this is a section right here where you can view your airman record in PDF format. So you can either click the tabs and move around and look at it that way, but that's hard. You can't really print it. If you want to look at something that you can print, you can click that link there and it'll do it for you. So I'm going to real briefly show you how you enter experience. We're not going to go into great detail on this one, but I'll just give you an idea how it works. So you click the Experience tab, and then you see you have a section there that says Add Employer, and then below that is a table that shows you previous employers you've already added. So the basic idea here is the only thing you have to add, or really enter, is the name of the company. You see here I have a sample, so it's test applicant, but you start typing in the name of your previous employer, like maybe type the first word or the first few letters, and then wait just a moment and a list will populate. And then from that list, select the employer. And then once you've done that, there is let me get rid of this highlighter. Once you've done that, then you can, that's different, it's a laser pointer. Use that. Okay. So once you've done that, then you would add selected, and it would add that company to the table. Now the nice thing about this is that it gets the company's current mailing address and all that stuff automatically out of FAA records. So you don't have to remember the employer's address and, well, who's the chief pilot. You don't have to do any of that because it pulls it out of active FAA data. So that's kind of handy. It's kind of a neat way to do it. I do want to mention that this only works if the employer is actively operating. If your company, went out of business, 4 years ago, and you still, of course, want to write them down, but they're not in business, you may find that they do not come up in this list. Well, that's why we added this button here, is Add New Employer. So you can click that one, and then you have to enter all the details, the phone number and the address and all that good stuff. You have to add all that manually. So there is a way to add companies manually if yours doesn't come up in the list, but I would suggest that you use the list feature. It's much more convenient. Anyway, so once you click, Add Selected, you get this screen, and I kind of want to pause here just for a second because this is actually doing something kind of important. When you're adding these previous employers, not only are you creating a list that's helpful to your future employer, but you're actually creating a legal document that gives that employer consent to release your airman records. So you don't have to complete any additional forms to authorize that previous employer to provide your records to your new employer. Okay, so you can see it's written in there, I consent and authorize my current and previous employers to release records pertaining to me. And it goes on to the extent. So that's part of the package that the hiring company gets, is they get all those pre-filled out consents, which is kind of nice because it means you don't have to fill those forms out again. So that's why we encourage folks to do the previous employer stuff, because we hope it will simplify requesting records from the previous employers. It fills out the forms for you, but you don't have to do it, but we think it might make things a little bit easier. So we'll move on from this. We'll agree to that. And then it tells you employer successfully added. And I don't really show it here in the slide, but at that point, it would add them to that table there at the bottom, and where they could, where they would be in the list. And of course, the list is editable. You can change things and delete. If you have the wrong company, you can delete them and add someone else. But that's the basic idea of how they add previous employers. So now I want to go to the other bit, which is how you grant consent. This is a pretty short process. You just click on the consent tab, and it takes you to the consent screen. And there's a little form there at the top that says grant consent. And then there's a table at the bottom that says air carriers with active consents. They don't only have to be air carriers. They could be any kind of aviation employer. It could be an operator, and in the future, it could be a Part 91 company, for example, that maybe doesn't hold a certificate, for example. Anyway, so the way that you grant consent to a company, the first thing we really encourage you to do is double check your airman record. So click on that link that I've got shown there with the arrow. It says view and print your PAR. And that's really a great benefit for the airman because there's no surprises about what the company is going to see. when you grant them consent, they're going to see this record that you're looking at right here. So another point that I will mention for the carriers at this point is that the airmen, when they grant you consent, they're granting you consent as it is, as the record is shown today. Okay, so if I grant you consent to my record today, and then in 2 weeks there's a new type rating added, and then you pull my record out of PRD after that, you're not going to see that new type rating, because the record that you see is as it was the day I granted you consent. It's a snapshot, right? It's a frozen snapshot in time. And so if that's the case, it's very easy to get an updated updated PAR from the potential employee. You just ask them to grant you a fresh consent, right? So they come in here and they just grant you a brand new consent, and they'll have the latest and greatest record. Okay. But anyway, that's kind of a side note. So the way that you enter the record, you put in the company name, and again, you would type a few letters, and then you wait and let the form populate and make sure that you have the right designator code. A lot of companies, the names are very similar, so you want to make sure it's the right company. And then they have to pick the consent period. It's 30, 60, or 90 days. And that gives the company a window of time to pull that record and view it and print it off. And then you just click grant consent after that. And it gives you a little splash screen. We'll agree to that. And then it says, yep, that company was granted consent. And then it adds them to the table there that you can see. And so you can add another company. You can add as many companies as you need to if you're applying to multiple companies. And you'll notice over in the right-hand side, there is that PDF icon, and that just gives you yet another chance to view the record that's available to that employer. So there are no surprises. You know exactly what's going to be shown to the employer. If for some reason you needed to revoke consent, you changed your mind, or you just whatever, you decided you didn't want the record to be available to the company, it's really easy and it's instant. You just select the box next to the company that you do not want to see your record anymore, and then you click revoke consent. Now, it's important to note that if the company has already downloaded your record, they already have it, right? They already have a PDF document. We can't reach into their systems and pull that document out of there. But if they haven't downloaded it yet, they haven't viewed the records yet, then you can, you can stop that. They won't be able to see it. And then there's a little splash screen says, okay, we're going to revoke the record, and then it does it. So it's a really quick, easy process to grant consent and then revoke consent if you wanted to. So very quick process. So the other part I want to show you now, we're going to switch hats. Take off the pilot hat, put on the company hat. So now you're the employer, and you want to go in and look at the record. That's what we're going to look at now, kind of how that plays. Now remember, if you want to view records, you're going to use the left-hand button, PRD Airman Records. That's where you need to be, even if you're a company going to view records. So you won't come over to this one unless you're going to manage users, request to become a user or to approve users. So staying over here in the PRD Airman Record side, so we'll click there to log in. And again, I'm logging in as a authorized consumer. Those are the only folks that can look at records. So I type in my access credentials. I log in there. There's the splash. Let me get rid of that red dot there for you. So then I have to accept the notice to get to the landing page. Now this is the same role selection page we saw before that the pilot saw. And in fact, if the same person is a consumer and a pilot, well, they could pick, right? Do I want to go in with my pilot hat, or do I want to go in with my consumer hat? Okay. So in this example, because we want to look at records, you want to make sure that you've selected the role of authorized consumer. And then if you happen to have this role for multiple companies, which is possible, then you would also want to make sure that you show up in the right carrier box there. And then you hit select to go to the search screen. So this is the screen where you actually search for the airman. Now remember, you have to have the certificate number, and you have to have either the first or the last name. So you don't have to have both. You can put both in, but it's either the first or the last. It's a little confusing on the form because they don't put the red dot next to first or last. They do say that in the instruction there at the top, but in any event, so you put in your certificate number of the airman, and you put in their first or last name, and then you hit search, and we see what comes up. So in this case, it found my record. If the airman had not granted consent, or if the consent had expired, or if the consent had been revoked, or you had the wrong certificate number or the wrong name, it would just say no records found. It doesn't give you any hints. Like, it doesn't say, well, you got the certificate number right, but the last name is wrong. Right? It doesn't give any hints. That's for security purposes, right? We don't want people, you shouldn't have to be guessing what is the certificate number. Okay? You should have that information. So, so if those conditions are all met, it will pull up the record. So you'll notice that as soon as it comes up in the search results, there is a view button on the right-hand side. And if I click that, you basically get the same view that the pilot had. It's the same screen, same little opening screen with their airman's address and certificates and medical information. And it has a lot of the same icons, and not icons, but menu bars appear across the top, disapprovals and enforcement and those sorts of things. So you can just browse through the airman's record as it was captured, right, at the moment of consent. So, but this isn't very good for printing, right? It's on multiple screens, and it's just kind of a handy way to make a quick look at the information. But if you want to print it, which is, you know, you will have to download it and either store it electronically or print it to comply with PRIA. So I'll show you how to do that. Get rid of the laser. So we'll go back to the home screen, which is where you did the search in the first place, and the airman will still be there in the search box. And you'll notice that there is a button down here that says Add to Cart. And basically, if you want to be able to print or download this information, you have to add it to the cart first. So when you add it to the cart, you get access to a PDF document that has all that information. It will also include the consent to get records from previous employers if they filled those out for you. Okay, so if they did previous employers, that'll be in there. It's kind of handy. So the way that you would do this is you would hit the check mark next to the person's name. You might have multiple names. If you search for multiple folks at one time, that's fine. And then you would say Add to Cart, and it will add them to the cart. I'll show you what that looks like. So I've kind of zoomed in on the screen here. I'm not, this is down below where we were just looking, but this is the table that shows you all the records that you've added to your cart. And this is where you can download the records, or you can print it to keep it, which is of course what you would need to do for PRIA, you know, for compliance with PRIA. And a really important point here is that remember that those records are only available to you in PRD as long as the airman specified when they granted consent. So if they said 30 days later, it's gone. If you search for them in PRD, you won't find them because the consent expired, or maybe they revoked consent. So you can't use PRD as a record-keeping system for your company. It doesn't work that way. So you have to make sure you add it to the cart and then download it. There's a couple different ways you can do it. You could just click here on this Adobe icon, and it will open the file, the PDF file, and then from there you can save it or print it, whatever works for you. Or you could also click the checkbox there next to my name. You might have several folks here in this table, and then you could say download, and it would download them in a zip file. You know, it's kind of thinking that you would have maybe several airmen at one time. So it will accommodate lots of records, or just one if that's all you're looking at. Okay, so that's kind of the process there. So now I do want to go over some closing points. We're kind of wrapping up here a little bit, but there's some really important points here I want to make clear. So remember about the authorized responsible person. This is the only required role that you have to have if your company wants to participate in PRD. At some point, once we get rid of our beta tag, PRD will be the only way to retrieve FAA records. So we encourage you to go ahead and start learning about the system. That way you're ready. You're not having to all of a sudden figure out PRD when PRIA's got a clock on it for FAA records. Okay, so it could be the only user that you have in your company. If it's a small company, you just have one person, for example, that's fine. It does have to be a Part 119 position. There's a few examples there. Basically, Part 119 specifies required positions for particular certificates, and those are the folks that have to be the responsible person. And the PRD administrator, of course, reviews those folks before approving them. So that's how an RP gets approved. The FAA has to do it. Okay? So a little refresher on PRIA, because I want to make a clear distinction between what records are available in PRD. We've kind of already said this, but hiring companies or air carriers are required to collect three main types of information. There's the AC that discusses it. It's FAA Airman records, and then it's previous employment records from previous employers, and then there's NDR data, National Driver Register records. The PRD record that we provide today satisfies the top requirement, the FAA Airman record requirement. Okay, so if you use PRD today and retrieve an airman's PAR, that does satisfy the FAA Airman record requirements for PRIA. It actually gives you a little more information, right? We covered that in the beginning. And you have to retain that record just as you would any other PRIA records. You can't leave it in PRD because PRD won't leave you access to it forever. Okay, and that's kind of the slide that mentions that. It's only in PRD for a limited time. So make sure that once you find it, that you download it and keep it in your own record-keeping system. Now, regarding the PRIA inspections, again, continuing, requests for previous employment records and NDR data, that's not in PRD today. Okay, so you would have to continue using your existing processes for those other two types of information. Okay, but PRD will satisfy the FAA records portion of PRIA. Okay? And then we mentioned that PRD will begin to contain previous records after rulemaking is complete. So that's moving on in the future. Okay, so we're almost done here. So 121 or 135 carriers that wish to participate can send email. There's the email support line that actually comes straight to me, as well as another person that helps me. Or you don't have to do that. You can just go straight to FAA.gov and go to the Regulations and Policy tab, and there you'll see PRD. So you don't have to come through us if you want to participate in PRD. We used to have it set up that way when we first launched the beta, just to kind of be able to offer folks a little more assistance and that sort of thing. But if you don't want to, you don't have to come through us. You can go straight to PRD yourself, and you can register a responsible person, and you'll be in the system. So that's good. So there's the email, and we're really wrapping up here. I would encourage you to subscribe to PRD updates. This is an email-based system, and I know this doesn't tell you how to subscribe, but when I send this presentation to you in a few days, this is a web link. It's a kind of a long link, so it doesn't make a lot of sense to write it out here. It'd just be easier if you can just click on it when I share it with you and later on. So, but I would encourage you to subscribe to PRD updates so that whenever we have announcements about changes in the program or training resources available, that you'll get that information and you'll be up to speed on PRD. So this is the last slide. If you have any questions, as I mentioned before, I will be answering those by email and a follow-up message to all the attendees. I apologize for our technical problems. You didn't get to see the screen that showed it, but you probably have found out by now that on your webinar control panel, there is a section that says questions. And that's where you can type in questions and submit them. And you can type in as many as you want, and we'll reply to them in email. So that does conclude the webinar. I will leave the webinar open for a few minutes so that if you're typing questions, you won't get booted out. You can continue typing in your questions. But that's it. And I really appreciate you taking time to participate. Again, I apologize for the technical problems and hope you enjoy the rest of your week. Thanks. Bye-bye.